Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate.
Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill S5, the Tobacco and Vaping Products Act. Canada's New Democrats have long called for the measures contained in this proposed legislation, and we will work positively with the government to facilitate its implementation at every stage to ensure that this legislation is passed and improved as soon as possible. Madam Speaker, this legislation will save lives. Indeed, Madam Speaker, our party has led the fight in Parliament for strong tobacco legislation for decades. As we all know, tobacco products contain deadly carcinogens and many other harmful substances that are injurious to human health, and we know that tobacco products are also highly addictive. It's really a perfect storm, Madam Speaker, a terrible substance that kills, that addicts the consumer who tries it. In the 1960s, when the federal government was still unwilling to pursue an effective control tobacco policy, more than 20 private members' bills to control tobacco packaging, labeling and advertising were introduced by opposition members. More than half of them were introduced by NDP MP Barry Mather. In the fall of 1986, now we're talking over 30 years ago, NDP Member of Parliament Lynn MacDonald introduced a private member's bill, the Non-Smokers Health Act, that was Bill C-204, to ban tobacco advertising and to ban smoking in workplaces under federal jurisdiction. Unlike most private members' bills that unfortunately die on the order paper, this legislation would go on to become law, albeit in modified form, in 1988. And in 2008, former New Democrat health critic Judy Wasilija-Lease launched a successful campaign to ban flavors in tobacco products. At that time, of course, the addition of flavors to tobacco was another insidious move by tobacco companies to try to skirt effective regulation and continue to hook Canadians with their product. Now, the legislation before us today, Bill S5, was introduced in response to the 2015 report of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health entitled Vaping, toward a regulatory framework for e-cigarettes. So in essence, Madam Speaker, the proposed act before us today aims to protect youth and Canadians from nicotine addiction and tobacco marketing by granting regulation-making authority to the Governor and Council for the implementation of plain and standardized packaging for tobacco products, and by creating a new legislative framework for regulating vaping products in this country. Well, Madam Speaker, since it first took office, Canada's New Democrats have pressed the Liberal government to expedite the implementation of plain packaging requirements for all tobacco products. Plain packaging has proved to be an effective way to reduce smoking, discourage young people from starting to smoke, and decrease secondhand exposure to tobacco smoke. Every month we delay, more Canadians, especially young Canadians, start smoking and become addicted, and that will result in more Canadians dying from tobacco-related illness. Action is needed immediately for the health of all Canadians. According to the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol and Drugs Survey, in 2015, 115,000 Canadians started smoking daily. 82% of daily smokers started before the age of 18, meaning that of those 115,000 Canadians who start smoking pretty much every year, most of those people are under the age of 18. 1/3 of those people will ultimately be affected negatively in a health consequence and die from that tobacco use. Now, the Liberal government issued mandate letters to their cabinet ministers in 2015, and one of those mandates was to bring in this legislation. And yet here we are, almost 3 years later, in 2018, and this legislation is still before this House and has not passed. Now, what did the health minister and this government do when they were given that mandate? They decided to consult. Madam Speaker, consult about what? Did they not know that tobacco products killed? Did they not know that tobacco products were addictive? Did they not know that plain packaging worked? I'll get into that in a few moments, Madam Speaker, because all three of those questions to ask them is to answer them. We knew the answers to all of those questions back in 2015. So it's inexcusable that this government delayed and dithered for years to bring in this legislation when we know that every single day Canadians, young Canadians, start smoking, get addicted to cigarettes, and will ultimately die in large numbers from that. Now, Madam Speaker, that means that since 2015, somewhere between 250 and 300,000 Canadians have started smoking and become addicted since this government first said they were going to act on this matter. Madam Speaker, that is not putting the health of Canadians first, and it's not giving the priority to Canadians' health that New Democrats believe is appropriate. As Rob Cunningham, senior policy analyst with the Canadian Cancer Society, said, quote, "The sooner we have tobacco plain packaging, the sooner we can have the health benefits. Plain packaging will reduce the appeal of tobacco packages and brands. Right now, tobacco companies are using brand colors and logos to make cigarettes more attractive. That might include mountain scenes or feminine pastels. It might include super slim packages targeted at women." End quote. I want to stop for a moment, Madam Speaker. I think many parliamentarians in this room have been approached by members of the Canadian Cancer Society and anti-tobacco groups who bring with them samples of the products that tobacco companies are using to market, particularly to young people and especially to young women. Madam Speaker, that marketing is disgusting. They market small, slim packages that are meant to look like cosmetics, that are slim so they fit in a young woman's small purse at nightclubs. They are directly trying to addict young women in particular to tobacco products and using sophisticated marketing techniques to do that. They are marketing a carcinogen that is addictive, that kills, to our young girls and women in this country. And that needs to stop. Now, plain packaging for tobacco products would standardize the appearance and size of cigarette packages by requiring the removal of all brand imagery, including corporate logos and trademarks. Packages would display a standard background color, usually a very unattractive greenish brown, and manufacturers would be permitted to print only the brand name in a mandated size, font, and position. Other government-mandated information, such as health warnings, would remain in prominent fashion. Now, the changes will render cigarette packages almost indistinguishable from each other, which makes them less attractive to consumers, especially young people, and make the health warnings clearer, more prominent, and more effective. Now, as I said, in terms of this government needing to consult, plain packaging was implemented in Australia in 2012, 6 years ago. In France, Hungary, and the United Kingdom in 2016, and in Norway and Ireland in 2017. So again, Madam Speaker, we have empirical evidence from around the world, from jurisdictions similar to ours, that plain packaging works, and this government chose to wait and delay rather than act forcefully and effectively. Plain packaging is also under formal consideration in Slovenia, Sweden, Finland, New Zealand, Singapore, Belgium, and South Africa, among other countries. Now, New Democrats believe that Canada should have the strictest and most rigorous plain and standardized packaging regimen in the world in order to promote public health. So while this act is an excellent start, it is not perfect, and it requires some scrutiny to ensure it meets its full potential. For example, Madam Speaker, in its consultation document on the proposed regulations concerning plain packaging, Health Canada did not include the option of further regulating brand names beyond limiting the number of words they can contain. Madam Speaker, I met with the former Health Minister of Australia, Nicola Roxon, who told me that we have to close every single loophole in these regulations or tobacco companies will find a way to exploit them. And that even includes things like their name. If we don't put controls on their name, then you'll see things like Sexy Brand Smoking Inc., Young People Beauty Cigarettes Inc. You will see the tobacco companies use that kind of marketing to get their message to young people, and we as parliamentarians have to ensure that does not happen. That's why New Democrats are calling on this government to ban all brand names and terms with positive connotations, as is the case in France and outlined in the European Commission's Tobacco Products Directive. Canada should also prohibit tobacco brand variants, as they do in Uruguay. Now, in the past, partial marketing bans for tobacco have had limited effectiveness. When most traditional forms of tobacco advertising were prohibited, Big Tobacco's marketing expenditures didn't stop. They simply shifted to other channels, including packaging and the retail environment. So, Madam Speaker, plain packaging not only eliminates one of the last remaining marketing avenues available to Big Tobacco, it also enhances the impact of health warnings. Now, a bit on health warnings. They are the most cost-effective, self-sustaining way of communicating with Canadians about the harms of tobacco. Effective warnings should be large, prominent, be unavoidable, use color, and include pictures. Large pictorial warnings are the most effective way to reach children and youth and the most vulnerable members of our society with low literacy. But warnings aren't just about scaring consumers away from a deadly product. They're also about informing Canadians and providing access to support for those who need it to overcome their nicotine addiction. In Canada, every cigarette pack includes a telephone helpline number and a website for helping Canadians stop smoking. Dr. David Hammond, professor at the University of Waterloo's School of Public Health, recently informed the Health Committee that this approach has been extensively evaluated and works very effectively. Moreover, despite Big Tobacco's efforts to mislead the public, all credible evidence shows that the removal of branding does not promote illegal or contraband sales. The only research that has found any link between contraband market increases and plain packaging comes from studies funded directly by the tobacco industry. Specifically, this research comes from reports commissioned from KPMG that had to include a disclaimer that they are not to be used for any purpose other than what the funder decreed, because the terms of reference were so narrow that they cannot be used to draw any broad inferences. Indeed, KPMG took the extraordinary step of writing to the UK Minister of Health to state that the tobacco industry was misusing its work. So the argument that plain packaging increases contraband tobacco sales has been repeatedly put forward by Big Tobacco in court cases as well, and it has been rejected every time. In fact, 5 separate legal rulings have affirmed the positive impact of plain packaging, Madam Speaker. So this sort of deceptive behavior from Big Tobacco is nothing new. Today's fight for plain packaging follows a long and dark history of Big Tobacco engaging in orchestrated campaigns to deceive the public about the harms of their extremely deadly product. Indeed, in a landmark 2015 Canadian court ruling, 3 of the world's biggest tobacco companies were ordered to pay $15 billion for their duplicity. In his ruling, Quebec's Superior Court Justice Brian Reardon pulled no punches, saying this, quote, "By choosing not to inform either the public health authorities or the public directly of what they knew, the tobacco companies chose profits over the health of their customers. Whatever else can be said about that choice, it is clear that it represents a fault of the most egregious nature, and one that must be considered in the context of punitive damages." Madam Speaker, despite Big Tobacco's attempts to obstruct the truth, we know that of the more than 4,000 chemicals found in tobacco smoke, hundreds are toxic, including hydrogen cyanide, lead, acetone, arsenic, and formaldehyde. At least 70 of these chemicals are known carcinogens. We know that every day, 100 Canadians will die of a smoking-related illness. That's 1 every 14 minutes. That's 37,000 Canadians who will die this year due to smoking. Of those, more than 1,000 non-smokers will die of lung cancer and coronary heart disease caused by exposure to secondhand smoke. Madam Speaker, we also know that Big Tobacco has no qualms with continuing to aggressively market this poison to young people in order to encourage and exploit their addiction to a product that will ultimately kill them. But I am heartened to see that this generation of young Canadians is fighting back. I recently had the honour of attending Freeze the Industry's luncheon on Parliament Hill. Freeze the Industry is a youth-led coalition that is dedicated to stopping big tobacco from developing and marketing products that entice young people. I was inspired to see the coalition's unwavering support for plain and standardized packaging for tobacco products in Canada. I also must give tremendous credit to organizations who have been on the front lines of this battle with big tobacco for decades. Their tireless efforts have saved countless lives over the years, and though there are too many to name individually, I'd like to specifically recognize the advocacy of the Canadian Cancer Society, the Heart and Stroke Foundation, the Canadian Coalition for Action on Tobacco, Physicians for a Smoke-Free Canada, the Canadian Lung Association, and la Coalition Québécoise pour le contrôle du tabac. And of course, I would be remiss not to recognize the heavy lifting that's been done for us by Australia's former Health Minister, the Honourable Nicola Roxon, who led the global fight against big tobacco to bring in the world's first set of plain packaging requirements. That is leadership. Now, I might also point out that in Australia, tobacco giant Philip Morris brought a claim against Australia under investor-state dispute settlement provisions in a Hong Kong trade deal in 2011. Thankfully, this was unsuccessful, and another example of the misguided inclusion of investor-state lawsuit provisions in trade agreements that Liberals and Conservatives continue to push. By the way, Philip Morris also failed in a bid to challenge the constitutionality of plain packaging laws in the Australian High Court in 2012, and after a 5-year legal battle, Australia's plain packaging requirements were upheld at the World Trade Organization in 2017. So, Mr. Speaker, we can't underestimate the lengths and steps that big tobacco will go in order to continue to legally market their dangerous and fatal product. Mr. Speaker, Canada's New Democrats believe that we cannot give big tobacco any room to maneuver to continue to promote this deadly product. Canada must have the strictest and most rigorous plain and standardized packaging regime in the world, and that's what New Democrats will work towards. Now, Mr. Speaker, this legislation also deals with vaping products. Now, the New Democrats understand that this new technology holds promise as a harm reduction tool to promote the cessation of tobacco consumption. An expert independent evidence review published by Public Health England concluded that e-cigarettes are 95% less harmful than smoking, and they have the potential to help smokers quit smoking. At the same time, the long-term health impacts of vaping are presently unclear and require further research. Thus, Canada's New Democrats believe that the goal of any regulatory framework for vaping products should be to maximize their potential benefits as a smoking cessation tool while minimizing their potential health risks and curtailing access for minors. Publicly, Health Canada has not established a harm reduction policy or articulated the goals and administrative measures that one would expect for such an approach. At present, the vaping market in Canada is an informal grey market in which suppliers have kept a low profile and not aggressively marketed their products, which are technically illegal. There are growing fears that the passage of S5 will trigger the entry also of large tobacco companies into the illicit Canadian vaping market. That's why I will now highlight some of the weaknesses of Bill S5 regarding the advertising and promotion of vaping products and suggest some potential amendments to remedy these gaps. First, the prohibition on promoting vaping devices containing flavors set out in column 1 of Schedule 3 may be too narrow since all flavors could be appealing to young people. This legislation should be amended, Mr. Speaker, to prohibit the promotion of vaping products that could potentially be appealing to young people. Unlike the Tobacco Act, Bill S5 contains no restrictions on permitted locations for advertising and promotion of vaping products. That means that S5 could allow advertising on television, social media, bus stops, arenas, virtually anywhere. So this legislation should establish strengthened restrictions regarding permitted locations for vaping product advertising and promotion. While the current bill also bans lifestyle advertising, with some exceptions, there's no provision that states that only information or brand preference advertising is allowed on vaping products. This is another area that ought to be looked at. Mr. Speaker, Bill S5 would still permit lifestyle advertising in bars and in publications sent to adults. This provision serves no public health purpose and should be eliminated, since there is no need for lifestyle advertising in relation to a harm reduction smoking cessation device. And finally, Bill S5 still permits extensive incentive promotions for vaping products in places where young people don't have access. So things like contests to win beach vacations, access to invitation-only parties, tickets to concerts and sport events could still be allowed, and they shouldn't be under this legislation. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats will work diligently to try to make sure that the vaping provisions of this bill, again, serve the Canadian public health interests as much as possible, and will work very diligently in that regard. Thank you.